down to forced marriages, honor killings, female genital mutilation, the forced veiling of women. I'm not talking about those who choose to do it, but those who are forced to do it. We would ignore all of this, do nothing about it, and the only rationalization that these people could give me, and these were people in power, was to say, but we've got to respect their culture. And I thought, yeah, cultures are not equal. It's individual human beings who are equal. And if we're talking about, Holland is a very egalitarian society, so are the other European countries. If we want to discuss equality before the law for immigrants and natives, men and women, homosexuals and heterosexuals, then we have to first and foremost acknowledge the individual human being, regardless of colour and whatnot, regardless of culture and whatnot.
The argument that I've heard your critics make in response to that is that, well, all cultures and societies are flawed and have their problems. That's true.
All cultures are flawed, but what I learned in the last 18 years when I came to the West is Western flaws, the white man's flaws, his sexism, his racism, his prejudices have been criticized and radically changed. The white man is no longer as racist as he was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But men of color, and I'm not talking only about men who are Muslim, but I'm talking about Chinese, Indians, men of color, are excused from that same critical scrutiny of cultures, their customs, their habits, their religious principles. And so again, it boils down to, yes, all cultures are flawed, but if we want to aspire to a society, whether it's on a national level or on the global level, of individual rights and respect for human rights, then we have to criticize these other cultures just as much as the white man's culture was criticized. That's good for it.
You also argue in your book that there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is I try to separate Islam from Muslims. Muslims as individuals, and each and every research shows that people who identify themselves as Muslim don't know very much about what's in the Quran. They don't know very much about what the Prophet Muhammad said. They've only been taught you've got to obey the Quran and what the Prophet Muhammad said, and they're both infallible. The book is infallible, the Prophet is infallible, the founder of Islam. And increasingly, agents of radical Islam take advantage of that. But if you scrutinize Islam as a moral philosophy, I'm not talking about the religious dimension of prayer and fasting, I'm talking more about the political dimension, Sharia law, the concept of jihad, and the social laws that govern the relationship between men and women. You see that it is not, there aren't very different flavors to it. There's really one big flavor, and everywhere where Sharia law is introduced, you see the same violations of human rights and the subjection of women.
How do you reconcile that, say, with a country such as Indonesia, with the world's largest Muslim population, where there's a secular democracy existing alongside, I think it's about 90% of Indonesians identify as Muslim. They had a female head of state before Australia had. They worked closely with Australia to stamp out extremism and Islamist movements within their country. How does that fit with what you're saying?
So it fits very well with what I'm saying, which is Muslims as individuals can choose how much of their religion they can practice, and countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey were famous for a long time in the fact that a majority of their populations would only practice the religious dimension of Islam, and they neglected to practice the, say, political dimension of Islam, like Saudi Arabia or Iran. That is changing. You see that more and more Indonesians are succumbing to the propaganda, mostly financed by countries like Saudi Arabia and spread by the Islamist Brotherhood in Egypt. They're succumbing more and more to the political dimension of Islam. So anywhere in the world, whether it's Indonesia or Libya or Nigeria or Pakistan, anywhere where you see people wanting to practice more of Islam and introduce the Sharia perspective, the Sharia side of Islam, you see the same violations of human rights. And in Indonesia, we've seen not only the terrorist acts, but the intolerance toward Christians and the Christian minorities and the Chinese minorities, and also, again, the subjection of women. So it fits very well with what I'm saying. It's an ideology, it's not a race. Muslims are believers in what they think is a good moral framework, but most of them really don't know the content of that moral framework.
You're calling for an enlightenment in Islam, similar to what occurred in Christianity centuries ago. How do you see that coming about?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm calling for a separation of, if you want, mosque and state. In other words, that's why I keep emphasizing the political dimension. I have no problems with the religious dimension of Islam, the prayer, the fasting, the visiting of Mecca, anything spiritual. But anything that has to do with Sharia law, I think that is something that Muslims should reject. And by doing so, they'll be accused by the fundamentalists that they're not really true Muslims. But I think that is something that Muslims could come together and say, we don't want that part. And if they find that rejecting the political dimension of Islam, in a way, it is true, it doesn't really fit in with, because you have to accept, Islam demands that you submit to the will of Allah. If you don't submit completely, that means if you also don't adopt both the political and social dimensions of Islam, you're not a true Muslim. Then I would say to those Muslims, seek other alternative sources of morality and spirituality. Christianity, for instance, and I'm talking about established moderate Christianity, or the Enlightenment, become rational humanists. So Islam should not be the only source of moral framework for 1.57 billion people in the world.
But isn't that a big thing to ask people who believe in Allah to say, OK, we'll just toss that aside now and believe in the Christian God? You know, is there not a way that that religion could be, I suppose, modernised to deal with some of the issues that you're pointing out, of human rights and women's rights and things like this, but still retain its essential core?
Well, many Muslim reformers from the time that the religion was founded, or actually the political philosophy was founded, have propagated that. And they've all systematically failed. Why? Because they were killed, put in exile, they were considered to be heretics. And over again, when the radicals come about who want a purist form of Islam, they get what they want, and they get the major following, the majority following, again because they go back to the true meaning of Islam, which is submit to the will of Allah, all of it, not just a part of it. And submitting to just a part of it means that you're not a true Muslim. I know it is difficult to say, okay, convert to something else. But in the 15th and 16th century, in the 17th century in the West, it was also a big deal for Enlightenment thinkers to tell Christians, start using your own reason.
When you talk about it being a big deal and people facing a lot of controversy for saying these things, I have, of course, noticed tonight that you've had to come in with the heavy security presence. Will that ever end for you?
The first threats against me came in 2002, and I remember the Dutch authorities saying, we think this is a temporary thing. People have just been impassioned and they're very young. We'll send you to America, and when you come back, after 3 weeks, things will settle down. That was in 2002, October. It's now 2010. And in 2006, when I went to the United